Hello, today I'm going to show you how you can change colours in corner to corner crochet. This is the little example pattern that we will work together with grey squares and white squares. I've already made a head start, so this one is the first square of row 1 here. Next up, row 2, we're also starting with a grey square, so that's this one here. I've only just finished doing my 3 double crochets into my chain. So this is the part where you flip this part up, and then normally you would do a slip stitch to connect these two. However, if you have a look at the pattern, our next square here is going to be white. So instead of doing the slip stitch to connect these two squares with my grey yarn, I'm now swapping over to the white yarn. And I'm just going to leave this grey here without cutting it. You can save yourself a lot of weaving in of ends if you don't immediately cut your yarn and just see whether you can use it again as it is for the continuation of the pattern. So now I've got this here. I'm going to insert my hook into that chain here to do the slip stitch. Make sure you leave enough of a tail here to be able to weave that in later, and then just pull that through and connect with a slip stitch. Now I'm going to do my chain 3 to start the next square and work this next square into the chain space here. Back to our pattern, we've just done this square here. Now next up for row 3, we've got another white one, so we will increase, still working with white, and now we're back to working with grey. So again, instead of connecting with my white yarn, I will move over to my grey yarn. Now as you can see, this is the chain space we're about to work into. And because I didn't cut my grey yarn earlier, I can actually pull this across now and just do my slip stitch with this grey yarn here. The white one tight a bit. And have this going across. And when I'm working into this chain space here for the next square, I'm working around both this chain and that bit of grey yarn that I've carried across. So doing the chain stitches, and now going around both that wide chain and the carried grey yarn. 2 and 3. The next square is a white square again. However, because my white yarn comes out all the way down here and I need to connect my squares up here, there's not really a way I can easily carry that across. So at this point, I'm just going to bite the bullet and cut this. And now, same as before, I'm going to insert my hook into this top chain space, pull this through, make sure I've got enough yarn on the back to weave this in later, and then do my 3 double crochets in the white yarn. Next up, we've got row 4, and all 4 squares of row 4 are white, so we don't have any colour changes in this row. And then row 5, also the first 2 squares continue in white, so that makes things nice and easy for us. We can just do the next 6 squares all in white without any other colour changes. Here we are again. I have just completed the second square of row 5, and I'm about to do another square in grey. Now I'm going to show you a nice nifty trick. So what you see here is we've got one square in grey, but then afterwards immediately another square in white again. So if I cut my white yarn, I'm just going to have to take it back up again here. So there is a way you can easily just carry this across. We'll take our grey yarn and slip stitch those squares together. Now, instead of just letting the white yarn dangle around the back, I'm going to pull this up and pull this next to this chain that I'm about to work into. So I'm going to carry this yarn across and work over the chain and that white yarn here for my grey square. This works in this case because this square is already white. So you're not really going to see that there's an extra bit of white yarn going through. So working over the yarn, I'm carrying across. And now for the next square, I'm back to white. And this yarn will need to go up here. You could just carry this, but I think it doesn't give you a very nice finish. You always kind of see this. So in these cases, what I like to do is insert my hook into the bottom of this square and just slip stitch that white yarn up. Just makes your square marginally thicker. You won't really notice that in the end. And now I can do the slip stitch through my grey yarn here and start my next square in white. And again, this only works because this square is also white, so you do not see the white being carried across, and this square is white, so you don't see the white being slip stitched up here. Row 5 then continued with 2 white squares, and row 6 starting with another white square. So this is where we're now. We're now looking at another colour change, going from white to grey. And as we did previously, we can now just pull this grey yarn across, slip stitch this across, and then once again working into chain space and around that yarn that we carried over. The pattern continues with a second square in grey, so no colour change, just continuing in the grey and anchoring in grey and then working the next square in grey. Next up, we're going back to white, and in this case I did not carry my white yarn across because I would have carried it across here, so white on white, so far so good, but in order to go up here I would have had to carry it between 2 grey squares, and I just think that shows a bit too much and it's not worth it. So in this case I'm just cutting and starting afresh. Slip stitching this together and continuing with a white square here and another white square there. So I've just finished the first square of row 7 and I'm now about to do the grey square here in the middle, looking at where our yarn is. I've got my grey yarn coming up at the bottom here, so I can just pull that up, but rather than pulling it up, I'm going to do what we did earlier and just slip stitch this across to bring it to the top, just a couple, and then do the slip stitch to connect the 2 squares. And now I'm crocheting the grey square. And I am back to white. Now, you might have noticed I've got a bit of white here, which I've cut earlier in order to bridge to the other side. In a lot of graphic patterns, you might have this scenario where you have one colour doing something in the middle and then the other colour, in this case white, on either side of this. So instead of just working with one ball of yarn, where you then, every time you can't carry your yarn across, you cut and start fresh. A really nice way of reducing the ends you have to weave in is to work with two balls of yarn simultaneously. So to have two balls of yarn of white, and then whenever you get to the middle, where things are separated by the other colour, you just leave this end hanging, move to the other colour, and then continue working with your other ball of yarn. So if I had two balls of yarn here, instead of cutting this end, I could just continue working with this one now and work my other square 7, and then cut the yarn. And again, coming back here, I'd be able to just pull this up and then end up doing this square here before doing the last grey one. So it's a really nice way of reducing the ends you have to weave in and making a bit less work for yourself. In this example, I'm just going to cut it now. However, I'm going to leave a bit of spare because I know I just have one more square in white to do here. So I'll give myself a bit of an extra tail. And now again, just slip stitching these together and starting my square with white. I've now finished row 7 with white square here, and next up, starting row 8, will be a grey square. So first off, I need to move back to the top here, so do my chain 3. And now, instead of slip stitching with the white, now I'm going to swap over to grey, and as before, I've still got my grey here, so I can just carry that across and then work across that chain and the carried yarn together as we've done before. And just slip stitching this across here, pulling the white tight, and then working into the chain and across the carried yarn here. That's first square of row 8 done. Now swapping back over to white, and as I've shown you previously, when I cut this, I left a really long tail. So now I can just take this white yarn, do the same thing, take that across, careful not to pull too tightly, and then work over the carried yarn and just like we did up here, I'm going to do my chain 3, and now again, instead of working with my white yarn, I will grab the grey yarn, pull that across, and then chain 3, work across the yarn and the chain. This is the end of my little tutorial. I hope you found this helpful and have learned some methods in which you can carry the yarn across to avoid weaving in quite as many ends as you otherwise would. As I said before, if you have a pattern where you've got one colour on either side of another colour, it can often really help to have two balls of yarn simultaneously and just work one side with one and the other side with the other. Reduces the amount of ends you have to cut and start afresh on the other side. And then, of course, the amount of ends you have to weave in the end. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye.